Most Americans think that the Coast Guard just rescues people in distress, checks life jackets, maybe pulls someone over for just boating violations. What most people don't realize is that the Coast Guard is one of the most powerful federal law enforcement agencies in the United States, with authority that extends beyond U.S. borders. Today, I want to walk you through what Coast Guard law enforcement actually is, where that authority comes from, how it works in real life, and why this mission plays a much bigger role in national security than most people ever hear about. By the end of this video, you are going to understand why the Coast Guard operates where no other agency legally can. So before the Coast Guard even existed by name, the United States needed maritime law enforcement. In 1790, the brand new federal government was nearly broke. Congress had passed tariffs to generate revenue, but smugglers were avoiding ports, unloading cargo at night, and never paying taxes. Alexander Hamilton pushed the creation of the Revenue Cutter Service under the Department of the Treasury. These cutters were armed vessels whose sole purpose was to enforce law at sea. They boarded ships, they seized contraband, they arrested smugglers, and they enforced customs laws. That means the Coast Guard's federal law enforcement mission is older than most federal agencies, older than the modern Navy, and deeply embedded in the country's economic survival from the very beginning. Law enforcement is not a secondary mission, it's the foundation. So that original enforcement role evolved into what we now see codified in Title 14 of the United States Code. So Title 14 authorizes the Coast Guard to enforce federal law upon the high seas and where the U.S. has jurisdiction. It gives Coast Guard personnel the authority to board vessels to search them, examine them, arrest, seize, inspect, and inquire. This authority exists without warrants on the high seas because maritime law recognizes that ships can flee, they can destroy evidence, and they can disappear across borders within hours. Congress deliberately gave the Coast Guard immediate enforcement power because delay at sea means failure. No other military branches operate with this kind of authority on a daily basis. If you want to understand modern Coast Guard drug interdictions, you have to take a look at the Prohibition. In the 1920s, alcohol smugglers became a massive criminal enterprise. Rum runners used fast boats, offshore motherships, and international routes to evade authorities. The Coast Guard was tasked with stopping this. They expanded rapidly. They added aircrafts, developed pursuit tactics, and conducted dangerous boardings at sea. Many of the pursuit and interdiction techniques that are used today were defined and refined during this era. When Prohibition ended, the mission changed, but the tactics and the authority stayed. Alcohol smuggling gave way to narcotics. Rum runners became drug traffickers, and the Coast Guard adapted again. Today, Coast Guard cutters and aircrafts interdict drug smuggling vessels thousands of miles offshore. These are not traffic stops. These are operations targeting transnational criminal organizations. A single interdiction can seize tens of thousands of pounds of cocaine, removing billions of dollars from criminal networks before those drugs even reach land. In the 1980s and the 1990s, as cocaine trafficking surged, some of the smallest Coast Guard crews were conducting some of the largest drug seizures in U.S. history with little public attention. That is federal law enforcement operating at a strategic level. So migrant interdiction is another example of how Coast Guard law enforcement looks different from what most people imagine. Crews encounter unsafe vessels carrying migrants in life-threatening conditions. The response includes rescue, medical care, food, water, and safety, while they are also enforcing U.S. immigration law. This mission blends enforcement with humanitarian responsibility. It happens far from cameras, often in extreme conditions, with decisions that carry real human consequences. Fisheries law enforcement is one of the least understood, yet pretty important Coast Guard mission. Living marine resources aren't just fish. They are economic lifelines, food security, international agreements, and environmental stability. From the early days of the Revenue Cutter Service, cutters enforced fishing regulations to protect American industries from foreign exploitation and domestic overfishing. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, cutters were already enforcing fishing treaties and protecting seal populations in the Bering Sea. These were some of the earliest international conservation enforcement efforts in U.S. history. Today, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing is a multi-million-dollar global problem. It's tied to organized crime, forced labor, and geopolitical pressure campaigns. The Coast Guard enforces fisheries laws inside the U.S. exclusive economic zone and internationally through agreements with partner nations. When Coast Guard teams inspect a fishing vessel, they are not just checking for nets. They are enforcing sovereignty, protecting American fishermen, and preserving ecosystems that entire communities depend on. This is federal law enforcement with a generational impact. Ports, waterways, and coastal security became a defining law enforcement mission right after September 11th, 2021. Overnight, the Coast Guard was tasked with securing thousands of miles of coastline, hundreds of ports, and critical infrastructure that supports the U.S. economy. But this mission didn't just appear out of nowhere. Historically, Coast Guard has always regulated vessel safety, shipping standards, and port access. After 9/11, that regulatory authority became frontline security enforcement. The Coast Guard inspects foreign vessels even before they enter U.S. ports. It enforces security zones, it escorts high-value assets, and it prevents unauthorized access to critical infrastructure. This is how our law enforcement is designed to stop attacks before it even happens. When PWCS works, nothing happens. Ships move, commerce flows, ports stay open. Silence is success. Most Coast Guard law enforcement missions will never make headlines because they are preventing disasters instead of responding to them. No ecological collapse because illegal fishing was stopped. No economic shutdown because ports remained secure. No crisis because threats never materialized. When the Coast Guard does its job well, sometimes the public never knows. That invisibility is often mistaken for insignificance, when it is the exact opposite. When people misunderstand Coast Guard law enforcement, they underestimate its value, and that affects funding, readiness, and long-term national security. The Coast Guard enforces U.S. laws every single day across oceans, ports, fisheries, and shipping lanes that the nation depends on. Understanding that matters. The Coast Guard does far more law enforcement than any one person could realize. It always has, and now you know why.